here we go. Last one, American Indians. I say it's the most important one. On the AP U.S. History Concept Outline in every time period, from time period 1 almost all the way through time period 9, really I think it's time period 8, they have American Indians mentioned. So you better have an understanding of the American Indians through every time period. 1491 I mentioned a lot in migration as far as what 1491 is. Know where some Indian tribes are located. Aztecs, of course, think of Mexico. If you think of the Massasoit, it makes sense that they're in Massachusetts. Powhatan, you should know that they're located in Virginia. Seminoles, the Seminole Indians, if you know anything about Florida State, the Seminole Indians are going to be located in Florida. The Cherokees, they're going to be moved out of Georgia, so of course that's where the Cherokees are primarily located. And then the Sioux Indians are going to be in the Great Plains. That's where they're going to be located. In Arizona, you're going to have, home field advantage again. Arizona, you're going to have the Navajos, the Apaches, the Honohotum, the Anasazis. You have all these different groups that are located in Arizona. And then, of course, Oklahoma. You have where there are quite a few American Indians. Why? Well, that's where Jackson and the end of the Trail of Tears was. So 1491, kind of have an idea where the American Indians are at. Population-wise, in North America, they say between 4 and 7 million. I know that's a huge variation, but there was no census. So up to Columbus coming here, there's about 4 to 7 million. And by 1750, I mentioned this in a previous episode, that 90% of the Indians that will be killed by disease. And by 1750, the population had dropped to about 1.5 million. So if you say, 1.5 or 1 million around 1750, that's what the population of the population of American Indians were. They have returned though to about 4 to 7 million. I think, the last time I looked at it, I think it was around 6 million is what the population of American Indians are in the United States. 1492, of course. Who's sailing the ocean blue? That would be Columbus. Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, sponsored by the Spanish. Makes a tragic error. And what's the tragic error going to be? No, not running into the new continent. The tragic error is going to be naming the inhabitants of the new continent Indians. And from that point forward, we call them American Indians. It goes through some shifts in Native Americans. This is more of a yacht thing. I like to call the American Indians because I'm a Native American. I was born here. American Indians, it kind of distinguishes between the Indians of India and the American Indians. But Aborigines are more Australian, the original people. But it's a term that we have grown to know, so that's why American Indians I use in my class. 1494, I like to talk about the Treaty of Tordesillas quickly, talking about how that divides the New World, does affect the American Indians, divides the New World between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Portuguese pretty much getting the short end of that stick, getting most of Brazil, and the rest to the Spanish. This is, you see the growth of the mestizo during this time period. The Spanish really force their way in. They take over. I always find it fascinating that this growth of this new race is almost a forced through marriage and rape and that type of stuff of the American Indians. And so they get rid of a culture and they create a new culture called the mestizo. 1500s, of course, you're going to see the lowering of the Indian population, primarily, like I said before, because of disease. Warfare is probably going to be the biggest way that the American Indians are going to fight back against the Indians. Against the Spanish, against the different people that are coming here. But if there's a group that actually somewhat gets along with the American Indians more than most of the colonies, is going to be the French. The French are actually going to get along with them. The Dutch swindle them out of New York. You just have many different examples of how the American Indians are going to be taken advantage of. The American Indians are a Neolithic society. The Europeans are going to confront a Neolithic society, a hunting and gathering, and in doing so, they take advantage of them. They do introduce the horse. The American Indians become more mobile in the 1500s because of the introduction of the horse. You have the breeding of different cows that create the Texas Longhorn, but you're going to see a conquering of these societies by the European culture, and they're pretty much dividing themselves up. It's instead of the scramble from Africa that takes place in the 1800s, it's a scramble for North America in the 1500s. That's what the 1500s could be called. You want to be really good and kind of show your strengths, say, hey, it's a scramble for North America in the 1500s by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the Dutch. 1607 to 1754, you're going to see multiple relationships amongst the American Indians and the British. Jamestown, of course, is not going to start off very well with the Powhatans. You're going to end up having, I think I mentioned before, the Powhatan Wars. John Smith is going to try to appease that. John Rolfe will help out by marrying Pocahontas. But again, she later dies in England because of disease. Almost bringing her to the cesspool itself in England with all the diseases that they had back then, and the American Indians just weren't immune to that. You do see the Columbian Exchange that also takes place during this time period, where there's going to be a exchanging of goods. 1607, like I mentioned, Powhatan Wars, and then you move up to 1620. The Pilgrims come. They are greeted by Squanto, an English-speaking American Indian. You had the first Thanksgiving, and then the Puritans come. And the Puritans are really not going to adhere or like the American Indians. They see them as savages, see them as enemies. They will join with them. It's interesting enough. They will actually join with, I think it's the Mohegans and the Narragansett that actually join with the Puritans in 1637 and fight the Pequot War. The Pequots were the largest tribe in that Massachusetts area, and they defeat them pretty much in a massacre. It's called the Massacre at Mystic that takes place in 1637. Later on, you'll also see another expansion war by the Puritans in 1675. That's known as King Philip's War. Back in Jamestown in 1676, you're going to see Bacon's Rebellion. That's caused by conflicts with the American Indians, where Nathaniel Bacon's getting attacked by the American Indians. And so it just causes, there's always going to be conflict that are going to take place. I did mention before, as far as slaves, American Indians will be the first that will be attempted to be used as slaves, but in doing so, they're going to be able to fight back. If you see that 1607 to 1754 time period, you're really talking from Jamestown all the way up to the beginning of the French and Indian War. But in the French and Indian War, this 1754 to 1763, this time period right here, is you're going to see the alliances. Great Britain and France are going to have the American Indians side on their they're going to be divided. The Mohegans and some of the other Algonquin Indians, I think, side with the French, and I think the Iroquois during the French and Indian War actually somewhat stayed neutral with the British. But you see George Washington actually start this war. He's the man that started the war that brought about American independence, but he starts the French and Indian War that starts in the colonies that later grows into what's known as the 7 Years' War over in Europe. It's the first international war that starts from the colonies, the French and Indian War. But it starts in 1754, ends in 1763 with the beginning of the Proclamation Line. The reason that the Proclamation Line is going to be issued in 1763 is because of Pontiac's Rebellion. If you can see Michigan, there's actually a rebellion that takes place out there called Pontiac's Rebellion, and the British are kind of tired of going out and having to stop the colonists from moving out west, so they say no longer along the Appalachian Mountains. Yeah, anything over the Appalachian Mountains to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, you can't move. Well, we don't listen very much. We continue to move out. But we feel like we deserve it. We feel like that's our reward for winning the French and Indian War, which end up leading to conflicts and taxes and all that stuff, leading to the American Revolution. So this time period right here, 1763 to 1783, is you're going to see a time period where the American Indians actually fight with the British during the Revolutionary War, which is not going to be good. We end up winning, and if you can visualize a map, it's sometimes good to have a U.S. map in front of you, but you can see the Mississippi River, where the Mississippi River runs. Well, that's the United States in 1783. When the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783 and in the American Revolution, our border is along the Mississippi River. And so we've taken all that land from the American Indians that had controlled it, and now we're going to try and, quote, civilize it. 1788 to the 1820s, you start to see the growth of westward expansion, beginning, of course, with the Louisiana Purchase, all the way up to the Missouri Compromise. You start to see the incursion of us moving into the American Indian land. I did forget. Let me go back. I think I mentioned Pocahontas. I think I did, so I'm going to go over that. But the one thing that I always like to point out, this is a 200-year mistake. If you get this one here and this one here wrong, because you have Pocahontas up here, and then you have Sacagawea down here. So it is alphabetical. Pocahontas is before Sacagawea, and Sacagawea, along with Lewis and Clark, going out and investigating the Louisiana Purchase. I mentioned 1820 with the Missouri Compromise and moving out west. 1820s to 1860s, you're just loaded right there. You have the 1830s, you have Jackson. Jackson, he's the only president that really has a name of a time period that's named after him, Jacksonian time period. But for the American Indians, he's probably the worst thing that happens to them. From 1831, from the Indian Removal Act, the main thing that Jackson wants is he does not want to have a nation within a nation. So he's trying to preserve the Union, very similar to Abraham Lincoln. He doesn't want to have that nation within a nation. He sees it as dangerous. He sees it as far back as the American Revolution that he doesn't want to have this nation within a nation. So he says, he pretty much tells the American Indians, you must become Americans, give up your tribal ways. Well, the Cherokees, located in Georgia, are probably the most Americanized, speak English, have English newspapers and stuff like that, but they don't want to give up their tribal ways. Jackson says, give up your tribal ways, and they say no. So what does he do? Brings the army down, and of course we're going to have the Trail of Tears. That you're going to have close to 16,000 American Indians are going to be moved throughout, not just from Georgia, but throughout the western part of the United States, which is Kentucky all the way down to Georgia, and they're going to be moved to Oklahoma Territory. Now, the Oklahoma Territory really stretched all the way up into the Dakotas, but you're going to have this territory that is going to now house the reservation system, and we're going to move the Indians there because they're outside, quote, the United States, and in doing so, we're going to feel better about ourselves, and Jackson becomes a hero. The 1860s, we do actually fight the Indians. Actually, let me step back. I want to say it's 1857, I believe, and it might even be, it might be post-Civil War. I'm thinking of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I think that's post-Civil War, where we're going to actually make the deal with Sioux. So I'm going to hold off on that just a second. 1864, there is a battle that takes place in 1864. It takes place out in Colorado. It's called Chivington's Massacre or the Sand Creek Massacre, which is actually an American Indian battle that takes place during the Civil War that everybody forgets about. That we're actually fighting out in the West, but at the same time we're fighting the Southerners in the Civil War. Something that's also going to hurt the American Indians is the Homestead Act. Lincoln issuing the Homestead Act. Go out, take the land, claim it, live there for so many years, and it's going to be your land. So that's going to affect the American Indians and their lifestyle as we're moving out. Another thing that Lincoln creates, that helps to create, the Transcontinental Railroad. That's going to have a dramatic effect on the American Indians because just the elimination of the buffalo. There's millions of buffalo, and by the time 1900 rolls around, there's just literally thousands left. It's grown back again. The buffalo population has grown back again, so much though that you can go to Costco or Sam's Club and actually buy bison meat, which is it's still kind of unbelievable to me. I want to say, and you don't want to quote me on this, but I want to say 67 might be the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is going to be the deal with the Sioux Indians. That the American Indians or the American government's going to make a deal with the Sioux, saying in the Dakotas, we're going to give you that land. That's going to be your land. You can have this land as long as the grass grows green, or until we find gold, which we will find gold later on in the 60s going into the 70s, which of course leads to 1876, probably the largest Indian defeat of the Americans, and that's going to be the Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876. I always go back to two Indian events that take place, 1676 and 1876, 200 years apart. Bacon's Rebellion and Little Bighorn. This is where Custer is going to go out in front of his men stupidly with the 7th Cavalry. They're going to be surrounded, and they're going to be pretty much massacred, with one survivor that's going to end up being able to tell what happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But from that point forward, the Indians are going to begin to lose battles, leading to 1890. I know those of you that are talking, oh my gosh, you missed Geronimo and you missed the Comanche Wars and you missed all the other. Yes, I'm missing a lot of wars. The interesting thing between 1865 and 1898, the United States is said to have had no major wars. We're not involved in any major wars, and we're not international wars. We do have domestic wars, though, between 1865 and 1868, and that's going to be the American Indians. We're going to conquer the American Indians between the Civil War and the beginning of the Spanish-American War. 1890, there's going to be a ghost dance that actually starts getting the people of South Dakota nervous, and in doing so, we send in the Army, and we have a massacre that takes place at Wounded Knee, where American Indian mistakenly fires upon some people. So the story goes that he was drunk and fires upon, or just maybe even fires in the air. Somehow starts the battle, starts the massacre, and that is known as the last Indian battle. The woman that you might want to know that will help expose a lot of these atrocities is Helen Hunt Jackson. I can't remember the exact year that she writes The Century of Dishonor, but Helen Hunt Jackson is kind of like the muckrakers for authors for American Indians. I always find it fascinating. It's Helen Hunt Jackson with the American Indians. You can tie that together. So if you have a Jackson thing talking about the American Indians, don't forget in the 1890s that Helen Hunt Jackson actually is a muckraking journalist that exposes the atrocities of what the American government had done. One other thing I missed. I know you guys were going, hey, how about the Dawes Act? 1887, the Dawes Act is going to be the Assimilation Act, that we're going to, Dawes Civility Act, that we're going to tell the American Indians that they must look like Americans, become Americans, cut your hair, get rid of your tribal ways. Luckily, the Dawes Act doesn't take. At least it won't take enough, because we're going to need those American Indians again in the 1940s, as I will address later on. 1924, the American Indians are going to get their citizenship. They're the first ones here, last ones to get their citizenship in 1924. You know, I got to pay tribute there. Before 1924, in the early 1900s, I always like to bring up Jim Thorpe. Probably one of the greatest athletes ever. Google him. Look him up. Jim Thorpe. Greatest athlete, I think, in U.S. history. Was able, some say that he could watch a sport, then compete in that sport, and in competing, he would be the best at that sport. The only thing that we don't really have is we don't have the video footage of him and stuff like that in his prime. But Jim Thorpe, American Indian, that was part of the Carlisle School, an Indian school that was created because of the Dawes Act. But very well known American Indian that won gold medals for the United States during don't quote me on this, but I think the '08 Olympics, I think. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt will have a New Deal, create the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and will give back tribal sovereignty. In doing so, helps to bring back a little bit of the American Indian pride that had been lost because of the Dawes Act, and that definitely pays off, I believe, in the 1940s. 1940s, you're going to get Native Americans are going to help tremendously. They actually helped in World War I. We had code talkers. I'm going to talk about the Navajo code talkers, but we had code talkers in World War I that were Choctaw code talkers that served in World War I. But the Navajo code talkers, of course, are going to be the most prominent reason that we're going to win in the Pacific. They're going to speak Navajo. Not only do they speak Navajo, but they speak a coded language that are given by the government. And the Japanese, and nobody is able to break that code. Nobody speaks Navajo. Nobody's able to break this code. And so it's a tremendous asset for us. And so luckily the Dawes Act didn't lose their language, and they're able to speak Navajo to each other. The other American Indian that I always like to bring up in the World War II, I always like to pay tribute to him, is if you know the famous flag raising at Iwo Jima. Those of you that have had me as a teacher, you know who's coming. The Pima Indian from the great state of Arizona. And who would that be? Yes, that would be Ira Hayes. And those of you that are Johnny Cash fans, just look up the Ballad of Ira Hayes, and he paid tribute to Ira Hayes in that song. Between the 1940s and the 1970s, you're going to have the Civil Rights Movement, which primarily is going to be driven by African Americans. But by the 1970s, you're going to have a Civil Rights movement for the American Indians, which is AIM. AIM, the American Indian Movement. I can still remember this, at Wounded Knee, where they actually take over Wounded Knee, and there's a protest there, and they're protesting for their rights and talking about that they want land, and Russell Means and a lot of other different American Indians that are really pushing for a lot of their rights. Coming from Arizona, I knew a lot of my friends were American Indians. I wish I could remember Jim's last name. Jim, who was a Pima Indian from the Pima Reservation. I went to grade school with him. It was the first experience that I got on what it's like in the Indian culture. I was able to actually go out to the reservation and see how decimated they were. And that's why by the time you get to the 1980s and the 2000s, you're going to start to see gaming introduced, casinos and ski resorts introduced to the Indian population, and really revitalizes a lot of the American Indian reservations. Now, I always like to address that there is a major difference between American Indian culture. The Navajos, they will not accept gaming. And so if you go onto the Navajo reservation, or at least in 2015, I don't believe they have accepted the gaming. And so if you go onto the Navajo reservation, it's pretty much almost like you're stepping back into history. Very poor, destitute, as opposed to if you go to the Gila River Indian Reservation in Phoenix, just outside of Phoenix, or you go to, I wish I knew the American Indian tribe that's just on the other side of Texas. As soon as you cross into Louisiana, there's an American Indian tribe that has a casino right there, and millions are always pulled in. The Pequots. If you go all the way back to the Pequots actually make a comeback in Connecticut through gaming. Make tons of money in Connecticut through the gaming issue. Of course, we're not going to return, the American government's not going to return the land to the American Indians, but we try to make up for the loss of land and the loss of life through money. I know it's the American way, and a lot of people are against that, and somehow it should be returned, but you know, the cat's kind of out of the bag, and it'd be very difficult to try to return and have that, because most of the people that are here today did not come or were not around with American Indians. The American Indians had the longest time period that they've lived here, but they were not they migrated also. They came here from Asia. So, we're all somewhat immigrants. the history of the United States and the American Indians is not a good history, and you should know the history of the United States. I think it's the greatest country in the United States, but you better know its history. We've done some bad things to a lot of different people, but still, I am very proud of our country. I think it's the best country that there is on the planet. And why do I say that? Well, people keep coming here. More Africans have moved to the United States from the continent of Africa than were ever brought here by slaves. I wish for the American Indians that we could do more and help more. That could actually bolster their livelihood, their ability to prosper in the United States, and kind of assimilate in, because that's the secret of our country. It's assimilation. I don't want to get off too much because you're getting bored and you're going, hey, this is 25 minutes and I'm almost heading towards 26 minutes. So I'm going to sort of wrap this up, but I do thank you for tuning in. This is my last of my 4 different presentations on the major things that you should somewhat know as far as a concept outline in these group identities, and hopefully I was able to help. Have a great night, have a great day, whatever part of the day it happens to be.